Something low and steady is moving through the walls of a house in the middle of the night. The room is dark. The street outside holds no traffic. There is no appliance running, no wind pressing at the windows, no machinery from a neighboring property that would account for what is being felt. And yet there it is, a sound, or something close enough to a sound that the distinction hardly matters at this hour, occupying the lower registers of perception in the way that a held organ note occupies a church long after the keys have been released. It does not seem to arrive from any particular direction. It is not louder near the window than it is near the door. It carries slightly more in the chest than in the ears, which is the first indication that something about this sound is not behaving the way most sounds do. The house is otherwise silent. This is the thing that makes the situation so particular. Silence has a texture to it, a kind of acoustic emptiness that most people find comfortable and unremarkable, and into that emptiness something has moved. It pulses very slowly, not rapidly, not in a way that draws attention to its rhythm, the way a dripping tap would, but in a long, gradual throb, like the breath of something enormous at a very great distance. The person lying awake in that house is not frightened. They are attentive. They have begun, without quite deciding to, listening very carefully to something that will not locate itself. This experience has been documented across the English-speaking world and well beyond it for at least 7 decades. The people who report it are not, in the main, connected to one another. They do not belong to a single community, or a single region, or a single set of circumstances. What they share is the sound itself, or more precisely, the perception of it, described in terms so consistent across different countries and different decades that the consistency itself became one of the first things researchers noticed when they began comparing accounts. The term that gathered around the phenomenon, informally at first, and then with some clinical specificity, is simply the hum, capitalized, eventually, in the way that phenomena earn capitals, by being sufficiently consistent and sufficiently strange to deserve the weight of a proper noun. Reports clustering under that name have been documented in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and across a number of European countries, with researchers in several fields collecting hundreds of independent hearer accounts across dozens of distinct geographic locations. What those accounts share, the low frequency, the nighttime intensity, the indoor persistence, the absence of any identifiable source, gives the phenomenon a recognizable shape even before anyone has agreed on what is producing it. The shape of the sound itself, as hearers describe it, falls within a frequency range of approximately 30 to 80 cycles per second. That measurement, for context, places the hum well below the lowest note a concert grand piano is capable of producing. It sits in a register where sound stops being something the ears catch cleanly and begins to be something the body apprehends, more diffusely felt in the sternum or in the soft tissue behind the eyes or in the low back, rather than tracked precisely by the auditory system the way speech or music would be. Most people, hearing a tone in this range under controlled conditions, would describe it less as a note and more as a pressure. At its lowest reaches, around 30 cycles per second, it is almost more sensation than sound. The physics of waves at this frequency have a quality that sets them apart from almost everything else the human ear typically encounters. A sound wave, at its most basic, is a series of compressions and rarefactions moving through a medium air, water, rock, or the material of a building's frame. The distance between one compression and the next, called the wavelength, depends entirely on the frequency. At 30 cycles per second, a single wavelength in air is just over 11 meters long. At the lower end of speech, around 300 cycles per second, the wavelength is closer to 1 meter. The difference is not merely a matter of scale. Long wavelengths pass through obstacles, walls, floors, the layered construction of a building, without losing much of their energy to reflection or absorption. They do not bounce back from surfaces the way higher frequency sounds tend to do. They pass through. This is why the sound is described consistently as coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. It is not arriving through the window. It is moving through the structure itself, equally present on all sides, which makes it nearly impossible to localize the way an ordinary sound can be localized by turning the head. The same physical properties that allow low-frequency sound to pass through walls allow it to travel extraordinary distances through the ground. Seismic energy at these frequencies, generated by processes far away, moves through the Earth's crust with very little attenuation, which is to say, with very little loss of power over distance. A vibration at 40 cycles per second, generated by something tens or hundreds of miles away, may arrive at a given location with nearly as much energy as it had at its source. The ground beneath a quiet house in a rural area is not, acoustically speaking, empty. It is threaded through with energies from many directions, and most of those energies are too faint or too low to register in any way that a person standing on the surface would detect. Most people, not all. Among the people who report hearing the hum, one of the first details investigators noted was how geographically isolated the reports often were from one another. In communities that have been formally studied, the proportion of the local population who report hearing a persistent low-frequency sound typically falls somewhere between 2 and 4%. That figure is striking for several reasons, but perhaps the most immediately interesting is what it means physically. Two neighbors living in adjacent houses on the same street, built from the same materials, sleeping at similar hours, may have entirely different perceptions of the acoustic environment around them. One of them hears nothing unusual. The other has been lying awake for 3 years, listening to something neither of them can explain. They are both correct about what they perceive. Their perceptual experiences are simply, and for reasons that remain imperfectly understood, different. This selectivity is worth sitting with for a moment. It tends to be the detail that makes outside observers skeptical. If the sound were real, why wouldn't everyone hear it? But that framing applies an assumption about how perception works that the biology does not fully support. Human hearing is not a uniform instrument. The capacity to detect very low frequency energy varies considerably between individuals, and the mechanisms by which the body might register that energy are not limited to the standard pathway through the outer ear and along the auditory nerve. Some researchers have proposed that the skin, the vestibular system, or even the skeletal frame may contribute to the perception of infrasonic or near infrasonic energy in ways that differ substantially between people. The selectivity of the hum's audibility in this light becomes less puzzling and more interesting. It is one of several features of the phenomenon that points toward questions about individual variation in human sensory biology that are not yet well understood. Hearers as a group describe the experience in remarkably consistent terms, regardless of where or when they encountered it. The sound is low. It is steady, or nearly steady, occasionally fluctuating slightly in what many describe as a slow throb or pulse. It is worse at night than during the day. It is worse indoors than outdoors. Moving outside often reduces the perceived intensity of the sound, or, in some cases, causes it to disappear almost entirely, which is itself an unusual characteristic. Most environmental sounds are at least as audible outside as in. The hume behaves as though the structure of a building is in some way involved in its production or its amplification, though exactly how this would work is a question that no single investigation has resolved to the satisfaction of the field. The physical effects that hearers associate with the sound form a cluster that appears repeatedly in reports gathered across many different countries and many different decades. Persistent headaches are among the most commonly described, not the sharp, localized headaches associated with tension or dehydration, but a diffuse, pressured sensation that seems to occupy the whole of the skull. Pressure in the ears is another consistent report, distinct from the popping sensation associated with altitude change and more like a sustained inward pressing weight. Sleep disruption is perhaps the most functionally significant symptom in the cluster, and because the hume is reported to be worst at night, and because lying still in a quiet room appears to make it more perceptible rather than less, the effort of falling asleep can become a prolonged exercise in attending to something that refuses to be ignored. The sound does not typically disturb hearers during the day in the same way. It is the night hours, and especially the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, that accumulate the most reported difficulty. None of this is to say that the experience is dramatic. The accounts, read carefully, tend to be calm in their affect, even when the effects described are genuinely disruptive. People who have been hearing the hume for years speak about it the way they might speak about a persistent low-grade weather condition, present, noted, occasionally inconvenient, but not overwhelming. There is a patience in the testimony, a kind of careful attention that comes from having listened to something for a long time without being able to explain it. They have developed, over months or years, a detailed acquaintance with the particular character of the sound they hear, when it is louder, when it fades slightly, what seems to correlate with its changes. This detailed observational attention is itself one of the more consistent features of the hearer experience, and it is one of the things that has impressed researchers who have conducted face-to-face interviews. The precision and calm with which hearers describe something they have had ample time to study. Acoustic measurements taken during formal field investigations in several countries have occasionally produced results that align with hearer reports in an interesting way. Sensitive microphones placed in locations where the hume has been reported have in some cases registered real low-frequency energy in the 30 to 80 cycle range. The presence of that energy in the measurements does not by itself solve the problem. The energy measured is not always at the precise frequency individual hearers describe, and matching a specific measurement to a specific hearer's perception has proven consistently difficult. But it has been enough to establish, in a general sense, that something is often present in the acoustic environment of places where the hume is reported. The sound is not, in at least some cases, entirely without an external correlate. Whatever it is, it sometimes leaves a mark on a calibrated instrument in a quiet room at the very lowest edge of what the instrument was designed to detect. The image of that instrument is worth holding for a moment. A researcher in a purpose-built quiet room, a space designed to reduce ambient acoustic interference to nearly nothing, places a calibrated microphone on a tabletop and watches the readout. The display is designed to show frequency content across a wide range, but what the researcher is attending to is a narrow band at the very bottom of the scale. The needle, or its digital equivalent, sits close to 0 for most of the time. Then, occasionally, it moves, not dramatically, not in a way that would attract the attention of anyone who was not specifically watching for it, but it moves and it moves in a frequency range that corresponds to the lower end of what the hearers in this location have described. The measurement is real. What it means, whether it represents the source of the perceived hum, a coincidental feature of the local acoustic environment, or something else entirely, is where the clarity ends and the open question begins. What researchers found across investigations in multiple countries conducted by teams with no particular connection to one another is a map of sorts, not a physical map, though eventually one of those was assembled as well. More of a conceptual map, a distribution of data points that share enough in common to suggest that whatever is happening, it is happening in enough places with enough consistency to constitute a single phenomenon rather than a collection of unrelated ones. The reports cluster in certain kinds of places. They share a specific frequency range. They exhibit a consistent pattern of nighttime intensification. They affect a consistent proportion of local populations. The pattern is real, even when the source is not yet identified. A map of the world marked with every documented cluster of Hume reports would show something instructive about the phenomenon's distribution. The marks appear across rural England, across the interior of the American Southwest, along the coastal fringes of Australia, across stretches of northern Canada. They appear in parts of Scandinavia and in communities along the Atlantic coast of Europe. They are not random. They tend to cluster in areas where background ambient noise levels are low, places where, in the absence of urban sound, quieter signals might become perceptible that would otherwise be masked by the ordinary acoustic density of city life. They also tend to appear near coastlines with some frequency, which has led certain researchers to consider whether there is something about the acoustic character of coastal environments, the interaction of ocean energy with the substrate, the particular way wave action translates into low-frequency ground vibration, that contributes to the conditions under which the Hume is reported. The geography is interesting, the selectivity is interesting, the physical symptom cluster is interesting, but perhaps the detail that carries the most weight, in terms of how seriously the scientific community has come to regard the phenomenon, is the longevity of the reports. This is not something that appeared briefly and faded. The accounts have accumulated steadily since at least the middle of the 20th century, and in many of the communities where the Hume was first formally documented, people are still reporting it today. The sound, whatever it is, has not gone away. Investigators have come and gone. Equipment has been set up and taken down. Reports have been filed and archived. The sound continues in those communities, unchanged and unresolved, present on quiet nights in the same low register it occupied when the first accounts were written down. There is something almost geological in that persistence. Geological in the sense that the hum belongs, at least in its character and its scale, to a category of things that operate on a timeline much longer than a human investigation. The waves involved, sound waves at the frequencies hearers describe, are not fast. They do not carry the urgency of higher-pitched sounds. A wave at 30 cycles per second completes one full cycle in a 33rd of a second, which sounds rapid, but the wave itself is 11 meters long. At 60 cycles per second, still within the range hearers describe, a single wavelength stretches to just under 6 meters. These are not the frequencies of conversation or music or the sounds of daily human activity. They are the frequencies of large, slow processes, of ocean swells pressing against the seafloor, of the resonance of enormous structures, of the planet's own background acoustic life. To put that scale in terms that carry their proper weight at this hour, a sound wave at 40 cycles per second, traveling through the air at the speed of sound, would stretch approximately 8.5 meters from the leading compression to the trailing one. A wave at 30 cycles per second would extend to just over 11 meters. At 20 cycles per second, the very lower edge of what most humans can detect under any circumstances, and the frequency range that some hearers claim the sound occasionally approaches, a single wave would span approximately 17 meters from front to back. These are not small oscillations. They are large, slow, physically substantial movements of air and ground, and the energy they carry once generated disperses through the environment with a patience and a range that shorter, higher waves do not possess. It is a strange thing to consider in a quiet room that the air itself is in motion at frequencies below the range of ordinary perception, that the background acoustic world is more populated than the ears suggest, and that for reasons not yet fully understood, some people have access to portions of it that others do not. The person lying awake in a rural house at 2 in the morning, listening to something low and steady moving through the walls, is not imagining a sound. They are perceiving, through whatever pathway their particular sensory biology makes available to them, something that is present in the physical environment and visible, occasionally on the readout of a sufficiently sensitive instrument. The experience is real, the question of its origin is genuinely open, and the sound itself continues, through walls and floors and the foundations of houses, in frequencies long enough and slow enough that a single cycle, stretched out through the air, would span the length of a city block. That measurement, one wave, one complete oscillation of compression and release, extending from one end of a city block to the other, offers a way of holding the hum at its appropriate scale, not as a small personal phenomenon happening inside one person's head in the middle of the night, not as a technical anomaly restricted to the readout of a laboratory instrument, but as something that moves through the world at the pace and the size of the world's own large processes, occasionally and selectively touching the perceptual experience of a small fraction of the people who live inside its range, and doing so without explanation across every decade since the records began. The person in the dark house is still awake. The sound is still present. It has not located itself, and it will not, tonight, explain itself. It occupies the lower registers of the room and the lower registers of the night, slow and steady and patient, in no apparent hurry to resolve into anything more specific than what it already is. At an elevation of nearly 7,000 feet, the air above Taos, New Mexico, carries a particular quality at night. It is thinner than the air most people sleep in. It holds less moisture. When the wind settles, which it often does in the hours after midnight, the silence that arrives is not the muffled silence of a low valley or a city apartment insulated by the noise of neighboring streets. It is the wide, clean silence of high desert, where the nearest lights belong to another town, and the mountains to the east are visible only as an absence of stars along the horizon. A small city sits in that silence. Its streets are narrow, and its buildings mostly low, and by 2 in the morning, most of them are dark. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains hold the eastern edge of the sky. To the west, the land opens out into a broad plateau, flat and pale under whatever light the moon offers, running toward distances that have no particular end. This is the setting that the first hearer reports arrived from in the early years of the last decade of the 20th century. A low sound, described as persistent and sourceless, moving through the walls of houses that were otherwise entirely quiet. The reports accumulated the way reports of an unusual shared experience tend to accumulate in a small place. One person described it to a neighbor. The neighbor had also been hearing it. Someone mentioned it at a local gathering, and found that 3 other people in the room had been quietly wondering about the same sound for months without saying anything, each of them half convinced that there was some ordinary explanation they had simply not yet identified. By 1991, enough people had made enough formal complaints to local authorities that the situation had begun to attract attention from regional newspapers. By 1992, the coverage had grown. A name had appeared in print, the kind of name that comes from the place a thing is found, rather than from any understanding of what the thing is. The Taos Hum, and the name, once it existed, gave the phenomenon a shape it could be referred to by, which meant it could be discussed, questioned, and eventually taken to the people with the instruments and the authority to investigate it. What the hearers described was consistent across accounts in ways that made the accumulation of reports compelling rather than merely large. The sound was low. Most of those who could estimate its pitch placed it in the range of a distant diesel engine idling, not a high whine, not a mid-range tone, but something felt almost as much as heard, occupying the lower registers, where frequency becomes vibration, and the distinction between the two softens. It was present at night more reliably than during the day, which was itself a note worth holding. It was not that the sound grew louder after dark, exactly, but that it became more noticeable, more insistent, harder to ignore or dismiss. Indoors, strangely, it was often worse. The walls of a house that ought to provide shelter from external sound seemed instead to concentrate the bev, or at least to remove the competing sounds that might otherwise mask it. People described lying in bed with the sound moving through them at a frequency too low to localize, arriving from everywhere and nowhere at once. The physical character of the complaints extended beyond the sound itself. A number of hearers described a pressure in the ears, not quite pain, but a sense of fullness or resistance, the kind of sensation associated with changes in altitude or the approach of weather. Headaches were mentioned in multiple accounts, persistent and low grade, the kind that settle in at the base of the skull and resist the usual remedies. Sleep was disrupted not by the loudness of the sound, but by its persistence, by the way it continued at exactly the same pitch and rhythm, regardless of what the hearer did, regardless of whether they moved to another room, or pressed a pillow against their ears, or lay down in the yard under the wide New Mexico sky. The sound continued. It was not responsive to attention, which is one of the things that made it particularly difficult to dismiss as anything the hearer was simply producing on their own. In 1993, the situation moved from the domain of local complaint into the domain of federal inquiry. New Mexico Congressman Bill Richardson, responding to the volume and consistency of constituent concern, requested a formal federal investigation into the Taos Homa. The investigation that followed involved multiple agencies, a fact that speaks less to the strangeness of the phenomenon than to the breadth of possible explanations being considered. Sandia National Laboratories was involved, based in Albuquerque, where the technical expertise covers everything from weapon systems to geological sensing. Los Alamos National Laboratory was involved, located less than 2 hours from Taos, with a research portfolio that spans nuclear physics, environmental monitoring, and acoustic science. The United States Bureau of Land Management was involved, given its oversight of the public lands that make up much of the terrain around the region. The Department of Defense was involved. Phillips Air Force Laboratory was involved. The list of agencies, set down in a single column in an official document, describes an investigation that was not treated as a curiosity or a footnote. The agencies named in that column were organizations with serious instruments, serious personnel, and serious habits of inquiry. The fact that they were brought together in response to reports of an unexplained sound in a small desert city suggests that whoever requested and authorized the investigation was prepared to take the reports at face value and follow the question wherever it went. The University of New Mexico was given the task of designing and conducting the primary survey work, which meant going door to door through the community and asking a very direct question: do you hear it? The survey reached approximately 1,440 local residents, a sample large enough to produce statistically meaningful results while remaining manageable in terms of fieldwork. The response pattern was striking, not for its size but for its precision. Approximately 2% of those surveyed said yes, they heard a persistent low-frequency sound. They could describe it. They had been hearing it for months or in some cases years. 2% is a small proportion in the abstract, but across a population the size of the Taos area, it represents a number of individuals substantial enough to generate consistent, comparable accounts. And the accounts were consistent. The subset of confirmed hearers that the university identified for closer study described the same character of sound, the same low frequency, the same range of approximately 30 to 80 hertz, the same nighttime intensification, the same indoor presence. 30 to 80 hertz is a range worth pausing on. A single cycle of a sound at 30 hertz, one complete oscillation of the pressure wave from peak to trough and back, unfolds across roughly 37 feet of air. At 40 hertz, each cycle spans about 28 feet. These are not the frequencies of a voice or a musical instrument or the hiss of a tire on asphalt. They are the frequencies of large, slow-moving systems, the resonance of a large room in a concert hall, the throb of a ship's engine felt through the hull, the vibration of the earth itself in the aftermath of a distant seismic event. When a sound at these frequencies moves through a building, it does not reflect off the walls the way higher frequencies do. It passes through them. The walls do not stop it. The insulation inside the walls does not significantly attenuate it. It enters a house the way water enters a sponge, occupying the whole structure. And for a person whose auditory system is sensitive to it, there is no obvious direction from which it can be said to arrive. The researchers equipped with sensitive instruments spread across the Taos region in search of this sound. The equipment brought to bear on the investigation was not improvised or approximate. Sandia National Laboratories, designing and operating systems for acoustic and seismic sensing as part of its regular scientific work, brought calibrated instruments designed to detect signals in precisely the frequency ranges the hearers had described. The sensors were placed in multiple locations across the landscape around Taos, in open fields, in structures, at varying distances from the town's residential center. The instruments ran. The data was collected. The researchers reviewed it carefully and with genuine scientific attention, looking for a signal that would correspond to the reports, a consistent source of low-frequency energy at the right frequency in the right location, detectable by the instruments and traceable to an origin. What they found was a question they could not fully answer. Measurements taken during the investigation did occasionally register low-frequency energy in the relevant ranges. The instruments were not returning blank results. There was something present in the acoustic and seismic data at the frequencies the hearers had described, or close to those frequencies, arriving intermittently and without an obvious point of origin. The difficulty was in the relationship between what the instruments recorded and what the hearers reported. The recorded signals did not match the hearer descriptions with the precision that would have allowed researchers to say, "This is the source." The energy registered was real, but identifying it as the definitive cause of the consistent, persistent, indoor intensified sound described by the 2% of the population who heard it, turned out to be a problem the investigation could not resolve. The data was insufficient to close the gap, not because the researchers were careless, and not because the investigation was limited by any obvious oversight, but because whatever was present in the data was not behaving in the way that a clean, identifiable, locatable source would behave. The final report produced by the University of New Mexico team was careful and precise in its language. It described what had been found. It described what had not been found. It noted the consistency of hearer accounts. It noted the measured low-frequency energy present in the region. And it acknowledged, in the plain language of scientific documentation, that the investigation had not produced a definitive answer to the question of what was causing the reported perceptions. The word that settled the conclusion of that document was not a verdict. It was more like a door left standing slightly open in a room that had otherwise been thoroughly searched. The investigation had been thorough. The question had not been closed. The document went into the scientific archive, where it has remained, cited by researchers who have worked on the Hume in the years since as one of the most detailed and honest accounts of what a serious effort to find the source produced, and what, after all that effort, it could not definitively say. Thus, in the years immediately following the investigation, was a place where two realities ran alongside each other, without resolution. The federal inquiry had concluded. The agencies had packed up their equipment and returned to their respective facilities. The researchers had gone back to their offices and written their reports and filed them. The investigation was, in the formal sense, over, and the sound continued. The same low frequency, the same nighttime presence, the same indoor quality, the same pressure and persistence that the hearers had described before anyone with instruments arrived. The conclusion of the investigation had not altered the sound. The hearers who had been part of the survey went on hearing it. People who had not been included in the survey and who had only learned of the investigation through the press went on hearing it too, or began hearing it, or acknowledged to themselves for the first time that they had been hearing something for years without having a framework to place it in. There is something quietly significant about that continuity. An investigation of this scope, federal agencies, university researchers, calibrated instruments, hundreds of survey participants, represents a substantial commitment of resources and institutional attention. The agencies involved were not organizations accustomed to producing inconclusive results on questions they considered important. Sandia National Laboratories had helped design nuclear weapons and develop sensitive detection systems for global monitoring purposes. Los Alamos National Laboratory had conducted research at the edge of what physics and materials science could describe. The Department of Defense brought its own technical resources, and when all of these were brought to bear on a sound in a small high-desert city in northern New Mexico, the result was a carefully documented acknowledgement that the source had not been found. That outcome is not a failure of effort. It is a description of the actual character of the thing being investigated. The years between the mid-1990s and the present have added to the picture rather than simplified it. Researchers who have followed the Taoist case and the broader body of Huma research it is often placed within have continued to document hearer reports from the region with a consistency that the passage of time has not diminished. The descriptions have remained stable across the decades: the low frequency, the nighttime presence, the indoor quality, the bodily sensation of something moving through the chest as much as entering the ear. The demographic profile of hearers, middle-aged adults, often in quieter rural or semi-rural settings, frequently near some geographic feature that would reduce ambient background noise, has matched patterns found in hearer populations elsewhere. The sound has not gone away. Whatever produced it in the early 1990s, or whatever allowed it to become perceptible to the 2% of the local population who reported it, was not a temporary condition. The geography itself plays a role in the character of the Tawas case that deserves some attention. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains form one of the oldest continuously elevated ranges in North America, with a geological character shaped over tens of millions of years. The plateau to the west of Taos extends across a region that sits above a complex of rifts and geological formations, places where the Earth's crust has thinned and shifted in ways that have left the landscape shaped by forces still operating slowly, deep below the surface. The elevation of the town places it above the acoustic interference that fills lower altitude urban environments. The air is dry enough and still enough on many nights to allow low-frequency energy that would be absorbed or scattered in a wetter, denser atmosphere to travel with greater fidelity. Whether any of these geographical features contributed to the presence of the hum or to the ability of certain people to perceive it is a question that has not been resolved. They are part of the context in which the reports arose, and context, in a case as thoroughly unresolved as this one, is worth noting with care. The hearer reports themselves had a texture that resisted easy dismissal. The University of New Mexico team had been careful in its assessment of the individuals who came forward to report the sound. The 2% who confirmed hearing the hum were not, as a group, presenting with the profile associated with psychogenic illness or mass suggestion. They had arrived at their reports independently, many of them unaware that anyone else in the region was describing the same thing. The overlap between accounts had not come from shared exposure to a particular framing of the phenomenon. Hearers had not, in most cases, read about the hum before describing it, because before the early 1990s, there was very little published about it. They were reporting an experience they had had privately, and the consistency of their descriptions with those of people they had never spoken to about it was one of the details that gave the survey data its particular weight. The survey form itself, a simple document asking residents to describe their experience of sound in the frequency range under investigation, with space for written notes about onset, duration, frequency estimation, and physical symptoms, produced pages of handwritten responses that described, in different voices and with varying vocabularies, the same underlying experience, the same low, persistent tone, the same impression of sourcelessness, the same night heaviness, the same pressure. Reading those responses together, as the researchers would have done in reviewing the survey data, is not a different experience from reading the accounts of Bristol hearers from the same period, or the reports that would emerge from communities in Australia, Canada, and Northern Europe in the years that followed. The convergence of independent descriptions across populations with no contact with each other and no shared cultural framework for the specific experience they were describing is one of the things that has kept the Tawas case interesting to researchers who are not otherwise disposed toward unexplained acoustic phenomena. The federal involvement brought something to the Tawas hum that most unexplained perceptual phenomena never receive: a formal record. The agencies that participated in the investigation produced documents. Those documents exist in archives. Researchers who have subsequently tried to understand the hum have had access to the methodology, the survey design, the measurement protocols, and the conclusions of an investigation conducted with more institutional resources than any comparable study of the phenomenon before or since. That record has made Taos the reference point for hum research in a way that other communities with similar reports have not achieved. simply because the documentation is available and the investigation was conducted at a level of rigor that allows it to be evaluated, cited, and built upon. The University of New Mexico's published findings sit in the scientific archive, not as a solution, but as a foundation, a careful, honest account of what the question looked like when it was examined closely and what examining it closely failed to resolve. The plateau outside Tawas on a still October night in the years following the investigation was unchanged by what had happened inside the survey forms and measurement reports. The land extended west in the thin, dry air. The mountains held the eastern sky. The small lights of the city were quiet, and for some of the people in the houses below those lights, in the rooms where the walls offered no resistance to whatever was traveling through them, the low sound continued as it had before anyone arrived to measure it, and continued as it does now, steady and sourceless and entirely unhurried, in a range of frequencies too low and too long to be easily named, present in a body of research that concluded with the most honest word available to a thorough investigation that had run out of room to keep looking. The University of New Mexico's published findings from the Tawas investigation occupy a particular place in the archive of things that have been examined carefully and remain, after all that care, without a satisfying answer. The document is not mysterious in its language. It is methodical. It describes who was surveyed and how. It describes the instruments used and the locations where they were placed. It describes the energy detected in the low-frequency ranges and the difficulty of connecting that energy to the hearer accounts with any certainty. And at its conclusion, in the careful language of a research team that has done its work honestly and arrived at the boundary of what the evidence allows, it records what the investigation produced and what it did not. A thick document of hearer interviews and calibrated measurements filed in an archive with a conclusion that does not close the question. What the document says, in its measured scientific prose, is that the investigation found real people reporting a real experience, found real low-frequency energy in the environment those people inhabited, and was unable to establish a definitive connection between the two that would allow the source to be named and located and presumably addressed. The word that settles at the end of that document, in the summary, in the conclusion, in the formal statement of what the investigation found and failed to find, is a word that sits quietly on the page without drama. It is the word that describes what a serious scientific inquiry looks like when it has been conducted with integrity and the thing being investigated has not resolved itself into a clean answer. The document has been sitting in its archive since the mid-1990s, available to anyone with the interest to locate it, describing with precision the exact shape of the gap between what was measured and what was heard. The instruments found something, the hearers reported something, the space between those two somethings remained, after everything the investigation could bring to bear on it, open. A damp evening in Bristol, sometime in the 1970s. The streets run in long terraces down toward the harbor, brick houses set close together, their front rooms lit against the early dark. Inside one of those rooms, a woman stands at her kitchen window with the tap turned off and the radio switched down, listening to something that is not quite sound. It is more like a presence in the walls, low, rhythmic, slightly too steady to be mechanical, and slightly too constant to be traffic. The street outside is still. The neighbors on either side are quiet. Whatever she is hearing, it is not coming from any of those directions. It seems to come from all of them at once, or from none of them, pressing in through the plaster and the glass and the floor with an evenness that makes locating it impossible. She has been hearing it for weeks. She has not yet told anyone, partly because she does not know how to describe it, and partly because she cannot imagine it will be believed. She was not alone in those streets. In the same years, in similar terraced houses running down similar slopes toward the same harbor, other residents of Bristol were making the same discovery, that the nights in their city had acquired a low, persistent undertone that was not there or was not noticeable in the daytime, and that intensified in the hours after midnight when everything else went quiet. Some described it as a throb, some described it as a drone. A number of them used the word diesel, not a diesel engine specifically, but the quality of a diesel engine, the low idle of something large running somewhere out of sight. The descriptions were consistent in a way that is notable when people are describing something without having compared notes, which many of them had not. Each hearer had reached their own language for the same basic experience, and the language across dozens of independent accounts converged. When enough of these accounts reached local officials, inquiries began. Bristol's local government received formal complaints. Environmental health officers made calls. The matter found its way, eventually, into the local press, and then further. The geography of the Bristol hum, as it had begun to be called, was not confined to a single street or district. Reports came from across the city, from areas with no obvious acoustic connection to one another, from hillside neighborhoods and riverside neighborhoods and neighborhoods well inland, from the water. This distribution made the question of a single industrial source difficult to sustain. A factory or a substation generates noise in a pattern that diminishes as distance increases. What Bristol hearers described did not behave that way. The sound seemed to maintain its character, regardless of where in the city a person was listening from, which meant that whatever was generating it, if something external was generating it at all, was either very large or very far away, or both. The local coverage drew attention that spread. The BBC aired material on the Bristol hum in programs that reached audiences far beyond the city itself. This mattered in a specific and practical way. Before the broadcasts, many Bristol hearers had been navigating their experience in a kind of isolation. They knew what they were hearing. They were quite certain they were hearing it. And yet the sound was invisible to the people around them, and to any instrument that had been pointed in its direction. The gap between private certainty and public acknowledgement is a particular kind of difficulty, and it had left a number of Bristol hearers in the uncomfortable position of advocating for something they could not prove. When a broadcaster with national reach aired their accounts and treated them as worthy of serious attention, the response from living rooms across Britain suggested that Bristol was not the only place where this was happening. People in other cities, in other regions, wrote in or called in to say that they had been hearing something similar for years and had not known there was a name for it, or a pattern, or anyone else who shared it. The legitimizing effect of that public attention is worth noting because it changed what researchers and officials could see. Before the coverage, the data set was incomplete, limited to the accounts that had made it through the friction of formal complaint, which requires a degree of persistence that not every hearer has. After the coverage, hearer accounts came forward in larger numbers and from wider areas, and the picture of the Bristol hum became considerably more detailed. It also became more clearly a question that was not going to resolve itself quickly. The sound did not have an obvious source. The instruments did not find one. The hearers continued to hear it. That situation, documented, investigated, and unresolved, would prove to be a pattern that held across more places than Bristol. In Sydney, on the far side of the world, the coastline near Bondi runs along a shelf of sandstone above the Pacific, and the ocean arrives there in long swells that have crossed thousands of miles of open water. At the surface, What a person sees is a wave breaking cleanly against rock. Below the waterline, what is happening is more complicated. Each incoming swell presses downward against the continental shelf with an energy that does not simply dissipate. Some portion of it transfers into the seabed itself, becoming a vibration in the rock rather than a movement in the water, propagating outward and inward at frequencies far below what most ears are tuned to register. The shelf around Australia's eastern coast is geologically active in this sense at all hours, receiving energy from the Southern Ocean and the Tasman Sea simultaneously, running a continuous low-frequency exchange between the water column and the solid ground beneath it. Residents of coastal Sydney, in the Bondi area, and in neighborhoods nearby have described a hum consistent with the character of the phenomenon reported elsewhere: low, persistent, more audible at night, more present indoors than outdoors, not traceable to any identifiable source in the immediate environment. The specifics of the Bondi reports share the features that appear across many harem accounts from different countries: the nighttime intensification, the indoor quality, the sense that the sound is coming from no particular direction. Researchers exploring the Australian case have considered whether the ocean's interaction with the continental shelf generates infrasound, sound below the range of normal hearing, at levels sufficient to be perceived by sensitive individuals, with the vibration traveling through the rock and sand and the foundations of buildings into the spaces where people live and sleep. This is not a settled explanation. It is a possible one consistent with the coastal distribution of many Humsh reports worldwide, and consistent with what is known about how low-frequency energy propagates through different materials. The ocean off Bondi continues to press its slow energy into the shelf regardless of whether anyone in the houses above can account for what they are feeling in the walls. The variation from case to case matters because the whom is not a single phenomenon with a single address. It appears across very different physical settings: maritime cities, high desert, temperate English housing estates, the flat Midlands, and while its character remains consistent in hearer descriptions, the environments it appears in suggest that more than one mechanism may be generating it in more than one place, or that the mechanism is something so widely distributed as to make geography irrelevant. Researchers working in this field have tended toward the position that the hum is probably not one thing with one cause, but rather a cluster of similar perceptual experiences produced by a range of overlapping sources, both external and internal, whose relative contributions differ from case to case. That position does not reduce the experience of any individual hearer, and it does not close the question. It simply acknowledges that a sound reported independently in Bristol and Sydney and dozens of other places by people who have never communicated with one another is not likely to have a single tidy explanation waiting to be found. Across the border from the American city of Detroit, the Ontario city of Windsor sits on the Canadian bank of the Detroit River, looking south and east across a stretch of water that is, at its narrowest, less than half a mile wide. The river there has been an industrial corridor for over a century, and the waterway carries heavy traffic and serves a string of facilities on both sides. On the American side, clearly visible from Windsor's waterfront, Zug Island sits in the river, a roughly oval spit of land made largely of slag and fill, heavily developed with industrial installations, blast furnaces among them, operating around the clock. The island has no residential population, it has no tourism, it is in practical terms a working industrial installation set in the middle of a river between two cities, functioning continuously and generating in the course of that function an enormous amount of mechanical energy. Windsor residents had been reporting a persistent low-frequency hum for years before any investigation gave it sustained official attention. The sound, as Windsor hearers described it, matched the profile familiar from other hum accounts: low frequency, noticeable at night, more present indoors, not traceable to any identifiable source in the immediate neighborhood. It was felt as much as heard by some hearers, a vibration in floors and walls that seemed to have no local origin. Complaints accumulated over time through city channels and provincial offices, and eventually the matter rose to a level at which both the Canadian and American governments were formally involved. A study commissioned jointly and reported in 2014 examined the Detroit River corridor with careful attention to industrial sources, and the conclusion it reached was more specific than most hum investigations managed to produce. The blast furnace operations on Zug Island were identified as a significant contributor to the low-frequency energy being detected in Windsor. The study did not claim this was the complete explanation for everything every Windsor hearer had experienced, but it named a source, a specific, identifiable, locatable source, and in the context of the hum's history, that represented an uncommon degree of clarity. Windsor is frequently described as a partial success case in this field, and the word partial carries weight in both directions. On one side, it stands as evidence that at least some hum reports do have identifiable external sources, that the phenomenon is not uniformly mysterious, and that careful investigation with the right equipment in the right place can produce a result. On the other side, Windsor's partial resolution does not transfer to other cases. The blast furnaces on Zug Island are a specific and locatable source. They do not explain the sound in Bristol in the 1970s, or in rural areas where there is no industrial infrastructure of this kind for many miles in any direction, or in the dozens of places where environmental surveys have turned up no plausible candidate at all. The Windsor case is useful precisely because it shows that the question is answerable in some instances, which makes the instances where it is not answerable more, not less, interesting. The Zug Island furnaces have continued to operate. The river between the island and the Windsor waterfront continues to carry the structural vibration of that operation through the water and into the sediment beneath it, and through the fill and rock on which Windsor's streets are built. A resident standing in a quiet room in Windsor on a still night, hearing that low and steady drone, is hearing something that now has at least a partial account attached to it, a named source on a named island visible from the city's edge. What that resident makes of that account, whether it changes anything about the experience of hearing the sound, is a separate matter. The sound itself continues exactly as it did before the study named it. In the northern part of North America, in the province of British Columbia, a researcher and educator named Glenn McPherson was working in 2012 in the fields where he had spent his professional life, sciences, languages, education, when something changed. The change was not gradual. It was, by his account, specific. A sound arrived. It was low, steady, and sourceless in the way that human hearers in other countries and other decades had described. McPherson was not unfamiliar with the phenomenon academically. He had encountered the literature. He had some awareness that people reported this kind of perception in different parts of the world. What he had not expected, and what no amount of professional familiarity fully prepares a person for, was that he would become one of those people himself, that the phenomenon he had understood as something that happened to others would arrive in his own auditory experience and remain there. What McPherson did with that experience distinguished him from most hearers. Rather than seeking a way to stop hearing the sound, though he did pursue that as well, without success, he applied the disciplinary habits of his scientific training to investigating it. He examined what was known and what was not known. He assessed the quality of existing data. He considered what kinds of research methodologies might produce more useful results than previous efforts had managed to generate. And he identified a specific gap that seemed important: the absence of systematic, standardized global data collection. Individual investigations in individual places had produced individual data sets that were difficult to compare with one another because they had used different instruments, different survey designs, and different criteria for identifying a hearer. Without a common framework, the geographic picture remained fragmented: lots of local data, very little sense of how the local pieces related to a global whole. Macpherson's response to this gap was to begin building toward one. His scholarly attention moved toward the European dimensions of the Hume, in particular, partly because European hearer communities had been documenting their experiences for the longest time and had developed the most sustained bodies of testimony, and partly because the geographic diversity of European cases, from England to Scandinavia to the Mediterranean coast, offered a range of acoustic environments that could help discriminate between hypotheses. A sound that appeared in a Bristol terrace and in a coastal Norwegian village and in a hillside town in southern France, in roughly the same frequency range, described in roughly the same terms, and with roughly the same demographic profile among hearers, was providing information by its consistency. The information was not yet an explanation, but the consistency was a scientific signal worth following. His work drew on both the professional and the personal. A researcher who has also become a hearer occupies an unusual position. They have access to data that no external instrument can gather because the instrument is themselves, and they can apply trained attention to an experience that most people have to describe from the outside. Macpherson's accounts of his own hearing were careful and precise in the way that scientific observation trains a person to be, and they carried a weight that purely clinical descriptions sometimes lack. Other hearers encountering his work found in it a quality of recognition. Here was someone describing from the inside what they had been trying to describe from the outside for years, and describing it with sufficient rigor that the description could serve as data rather than simply as testimony. The World Hume Map and Database Project, which grew from Macpherson's research framework, eventually became the most comprehensive global tool for visualizing hearer report distribution. Contributors submitted standardized reports: location, onset date, estimated frequency, associated symptoms, and other variables that allowed comparison across cases. The map that resulted was not a map of mystery in any dramatic sense. It was a scientific document, imperfect, self-selected in its contributor base, limited by the usual constraints of voluntary reporting, but it represented a scale of geographic coverage that no previous Hume investigation had approached, and the patterns it revealed, the coastal clustering, the rural and semi-rural concentration, the demographic convergence, gave researchers working in the field a genuinely wider view than they had previously had access to. Macpherson's position within both academic and hearer communities followed from this dual standing. In academic contexts, his work was recognized as a contribution to a field that, despite decades of investigation, had produced more questions than answers and needed better tools. In hearer communities, his standing as someone who understood the experience from the inside gave his work a kind of credibility that purely external research sometimes struggles to earn among the people whose experiences it is attempting to describe. The combination was not common in a field where researchers and hearers have often talked past one another, and it gave his contributions a particular kind of usefulness. A feature of the Bristol case that researchers would find recurring in other European accounts is the indoor character of the sound. Hearers across different countries describe the same thing. The hum is more present inside buildings than outside them, and specifically more present in rooms with closed windows, which is the opposite of what ordinary environmental noise does. External noise, traffic, industry, conversation, diminishes when a person moves indoors and closes windows and doors. The hum, as most hearers describe it, does the reverse. It becomes more distinct when the competing ambient noise of the outdoors is removed. Some hearers report that moving to a high point, a hilltop, a tall building's upper story, reduces the sound. Others report that moving below ground into a basement or cellar increases it. These spatial patterns do not map neatly onto what external airborne sound is expected to do, and they have been one of the persistent puzzles in field investigations that begin with the assumption that the hum is an ordinary acoustic phenomenon propagating through air in ordinary ways. The possibility that the sound travels through solid matter rather than through air, through ground and rock and the structural materials of buildings, would account for some of these spatial features. Low-frequency energy, in the range hearers describe, propagates through solid media more efficiently than through air, losing less of its amplitude over distance and passing through building structures without significant attenuation. A vibration arriving through the ground would enter a building through its foundations and walls and floor simultaneously, which would explain the quality hearers describe as omnidirectional, not coming from any particular place, present everywhere at once. Whether this explains the indoor intensification is less clear. Some researchers have suggested that rooms, as enclosed acoustic spaces, may resonate at certain low frequencies in a way that amplifies signals in that range, effectively acting as low-frequency traps that concentrate energy that would otherwise dissipate in open air. This hypothesis is consistent with what hearers describe and with known principles of room acoustics, though matching it precisely to individual hearer experiences across different building types and sizes is a complicated problem that has not been fully worked through. What the Bristol reports established, and what subsequent European accounts confirmed, is that the indoor character of the sound is one of its most reliable cross-cultural features. A hearer in a terraced house in Bristol in the 1970s, a hearer in a stone-walled farmhouse in rural France in the 1990s, a hearer in a modern apartment in a Scandinavian city in the 2000s, each of them describes the same spatial relationship with the sound. Outside, it retreats. Inside, it clarifies. The building is not a shelter from it. In some sense, the building seems to hold it. The European cases share other features that distinguish the hum phenomenon from simpler acoustic complaints. Most hearers in the British studies and in parallel surveys conducted in other European countries describe an onset that was specific rather than gradual. There was a period in their lives when they did not hear the sound, and then there was a moment when they did, and the transition between those two states was identifiable in memory, sometimes precisely dated. This differs from the experience of tinnitus, which typically develops gradually and whose onset is usually not pinned to a specific day or hour. The specificity of human onset across European hearer accounts has been noted by researchers as a feature that argues against a simple auditory processing explanation, since the auditory system generally does not develop new persistent sensitivities overnight. Whether the onset reflects a sudden change in the external signal, a sudden change in the hearer's capacity to detect a pre-existing signal, or something else entirely, is not established. The sharpness of the onset, across many independent accounts, remains one of the more interesting and unresolved aspects of the European data. Bristol, in the decades after the first wave of reports and the BBC attention that followed, did not stop generating hearer accounts. New people heard the sound in years when older hearers were still hearing it, suggesting that whatever produces the perception, external source, internal sensitivity, or some interaction between the two, continued to operate. The city changed around it. Buildings were constructed and demolished. Industrial patterns shifted. The harbor redeveloped from working dockland into something much quieter. None of these changes appear to have altered the reports in any systematic way. The human, in Bristol as in other places, seems to persist across changes in the external environment, which is one of the things that makes a purely external source explanation difficult to sustain on its own. Across all these cases, Bristol, Sydney, Windsor, and the wider European distribution that Macpherson's work helped to map, what emerges is a picture with edges that are clearly defined, and a center that is still open. The edges are the consistencies, the frequency range, the demographic pattern, the indoor character, the specific onset, the low percentage of the population affected. These features appear across different cultures, different climates, different acoustic environments, and different decades, described independently by people who had no contact with one another and no access to a common template. Consistencies that cross that many independent accounts are not likely to be coincidental. They are likely to be features of the thing itself, whatever the thing is. The center of the picture, the question of what generates the perception, whether it is external or internal or both, and why only some individuals develop it, remains open. Open not in the sense of abandoned or impossible, but in the sense of genuinely unresolved by the evidence currently available. Researchers have not given up on it. The data sets have grown. The instruments have improved. The global picture, assembled painstakingly from dozens of local investigations and thousands of voluntary hearer reports, is clearer now than it was when a woman in Bristol first stood at her kitchen window and tried to locate a sound that seemed to be coming from inside the walls. On the Detroit River in the hours before dawn, the Zug Island blast furnaces run at their ordinary temperature. The glow of the operation is visible across the water from the Ontario side, a dull orange against the dark that has been part of this riverscape for decades. Beneath the water and beneath the fill on which the island stands, and through the sediment of the riverbed, the structural vibration of the furnaces moves outward in all directions at frequencies too low for the ears of most people standing in Windsor's streets to register. In certain rooms, in certain buildings, at certain distances from the waterfront, a small number of residents lie in the dark and hear it, or hear something, a low and steady drone that fills the room without appearing to enter it through any particular wall. The investigation has named the probable source. The sound continues in exactly the way it always has. The furnaces will run through the rest of the night, their vibration spreading steadily outward through the water and the ground and the long dark distance between the island and the city, quiet as anything that large and persistent can be, present in the floors of sleeping houses on the Canadian bank of the river, moving through the roots of things, arriving where it arrives without announcement, settling into the low register of the night like something that has always been there, and perhaps has, somewhere beneath the floor of the North Atlantic, on every day of every year, without interruption, the ocean is pressing downward against the sea floor. Not the dramatic plunge of a storm wave, but something quieter and far more constant, the long, slow interference of opposing swells arriving from different directions, their energy combining and directing itself downward through the water column and into the sediment below. The pulse this creates moves outward through the crust of the earth in every direction at once. It has been doing this for as long as there have been oceans. The planet, measured carefully at its surface, is never entirely still. Seismologists first noticed this background trembling in the early 20th century, when instruments designed to detect earthquakes kept registering a faint, persistent signal between the events they were built to catch. The signal was not an earthquake. It was not any single source. It was the sum total of the ocean's continuous mechanical conversation with the rock beneath it, arriving at monitoring stations as a steady low vibration at frequencies so far below the range of human hearing that no one initially considered whether people might feel it. The energy involved was simply part of the background character of the planet. It moved through the crust the way heat moves through a wall, not as a single event, but as a continuous distributed condition. That background vibration, which geophysicists document under the name seismic microseisms, occupies a frequency range that overlaps, at least at its upper edge, with the range described by people who report hearing the hum. Most of what the ocean generates through wave interference sits well below 1 Hz, far too slow for even the most sensitive biological system to register. The upper portion of the microseismic band, however, reaches several hertz and above, and the question that some researchers have allowed themselves to ask quietly is whether individuals with unusual sensitivity to low-frequency mechanical energy might be detecting the outermost edge of this planetary hum through some pathway that does not require the standard route through the outer ear. This is not a claim that the planet's structural vibration causes the hum. It is, more precisely, the beginning of a question about whether the Earth's own continuous mechanical noise provides a background signal that the body of a susceptible individual might, under particular conditions, begin to register. The answer is not yet settled. What makes the hypothesis worth attention is its specificity. Microseismic energy is real, measurable, documented, and permanent, and it is present everywhere on the planet simultaneously, which would explain the global distribution of human reports without requiring a separate local source for each case. The planet's own low vibration is only one of several directions the science has moved in. Sitting in the same frequency range, though produced by a very different mechanism, were the transmissions of military communication systems built to reach submarines operating beneath the ocean. A submarine running deep cannot receive ordinary radio signals. The ocean blocks the higher frequencies almost immediately. To reach a submarine below a few hundred feet of water, a transmitter needs to use frequencies so low that the signal's wavelength is long enough to penetrate the conductivity of seawater rather than reflect off it. The lower the frequency, the deeper the signal can reach. At a few tens of hertz, a signal can penetrate hundreds of feet of ocean with enough remaining strength to be received. During the latter decades of the 20th century, the United States Navy operated a communication system in the forests of northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that used buried antenna cables to transmit at frequencies as low as 76 Hz. The system was called Project LF for extremely low frequency, and its purpose was entirely practical, maintaining the ability to send brief alert messages to ballistic missile submarines that needed to remain below detection depth during periods of strategic tension. The transmitter did not broadcast music or voice or detailed orders. At 76 Hz, the information capacity of the signal is extremely limited, and the system was used primarily to send a few characters at a time, enough to instruct a submarine crew to come to a shallower depth where they could receive longer transmissions through other means. The antenna arrays associated with Project LF stretched across enormous distances. A single antenna might run for many kilometers through the soil. The energy involved in transmitting at such low frequencies is considerable, and some of it necessarily couples into the surrounding ground during operation. Seismologists studying the background noise of the continental crust during that period were sometimes able to detect the 76 Hz signal in their instruments as a faint but measurable contribution to the local noise floor. The transmission did not stay neatly within the antenna. It spread, to some degree, into the earth around it. Project ELF operated with some interruptions and public controversy from its initial construction in the 1970s until its decommissioning in 2004. The United States was not the only country to build systems of this type. The former Soviet Union operated its own extremely low-frequency transmitter during the same period. Other naval powers developed similar capabilities. Each of these systems was transmitting continuously or near continuously into and through the ground at frequencies sitting inside or near the range described by human hearers in the same general era. Whether any of these transmissions contributed to hearer perceptions was never formally resolved. The systems were built with no knowledge of the Hume phenomenon and decommissioned for operational and budgetary reasons, not because anyone concluded they were causing sensory disturbance in civilian populations. What the LF hypothesis offers is a potential mechanism that is documented, physical, and verifiable in principle. What it cannot easily explain is why the human continues to be reported in regions far from any known antenna installation, and why reports have continued well beyond the decommissioning of these systems. The hypothesis may account for some portion of reports during a particular period, without accounting for all of them. This is true of nearly every proposed mechanism, and it is part of what has made the science slow and careful rather than fast and conclusive. Pipeline infrastructure presents a third direction of investigation, and it arrives at the question from a different physical starting point. Natural gas transmission pipelines run beneath the soil of most industrialized countries in systems of considerable length and complexity, and at the points where gas is compressed and pushed along these lines, mechanical energy is continuously introduced into the pipe walls. A compressor station operating at steady pressure generates vibration at specific frequencies determined by the mechanical characteristics of the equipment. That vibration travels along the pipe as a standing wave, coupling to some degree into the surrounding soil, and can propagate laterally outward through the ground over distances that depend on the local geology and the energy involved. Researchers examining the geographic distribution of human reports in certain regions have noted a tendency for clusters of reports to align with pipeline corridors. Not in every case, and not closely enough to constitute proof, but often enough to warrant attention. The pipeline hypothesis has the advantage of being locally verifiable. A compressor station is a fixed installation with known operating frequencies and known mechanical outputs, and in principle, a sufficiently sensitive investigation at a specific site could either confirm or rule out its contribution to a local HEM report. Some partial investigations along these lines have been carried out. The results have generally been inconclusive, with occasional suggestions of elevated low-frequency energy near installations but without a clean match between measured frequencies and hearer descriptions. The pipeline hypothesis also has a geographic limit as an explanation. Large stretches of sparsely populated Australia, rural Iceland, and other regions where human reports have been made are not plausibly served by underground gas transmission infrastructure of the kind described. A mechanism that accounts for some reports in industrialized corridors does not thereby account for reports in places where no such infrastructure exists. This does not disqualify the hypothesis. It simply means that if pipeline resonance is a real contributor to some home reports, it is probably not the only contributor and may not be relevant to many cases at all. There is a feature shared by the seismic, military transmission, and industrial pipeline hypotheses that is worth setting out plainly before moving on. All three locate the source of the hum outside the body of the hearer, in the planet, in a transmitter, in a pipe, and assume that some form of physical energy is arriving at the hearer's location and being detected by a mechanism not yet well understood. The existence of an external source explains why some people hear the hum and others do not, only if individual hearers differ in their sensitivity to that energy, either because of some structural feature of their auditory anatomy, some difference in how their nervous system processes low-frequency mechanical input, or some other variable not yet characterized. What makes a person the 2 or 3 in 100 who hears while everyone around them does not? That question runs beneath all three of these hypotheses without being answered by any of them. There is a fourth direction entirely, and it requires a different kind of attention because it begins not outside the body, but inside it. The inner ear is not a passive receiving instrument. It does not simply wait for sound to arrive, convert it to a nerve signal, and pass it on. The cochlea, the spiral, fluid-filled structure in which sound is ultimately processed, contains specialized hair cells that are mechanically active. They move. Some of them amplify incoming signals by adding their own mechanical energy to the motion of the cochlear fluid. This active amplification is part of how the ear achieves its remarkable sensitivity across a wide range of frequencies. The system is so finely tuned and mechanically elaborate that it is capable, in certain circumstances, of generating sound on its own. This phenomenon, the emission of sound from within the ear canal without any external acoustic source, was first measured in the late 1970s. The technical term is otoacoustic emission. The discovery was initially not widely credited. The idea that an ear could produce sound rather than simply receive it sat at an angle to how the organ had previously been understood. Careful measurement confirmed it. A very sensitive microphone placed at the entrance to the ear canal of a person with normal hearing can, in many individuals, detect a faint tonal signal coming from within the ear. The ear is, in a literal mechanical sense, generating it. Several distinct types have been characterized by audiological researchers working in the years since. Some occur in response to sound presented to the ear. The ear receives a click or a tone and emits a corresponding signal a short time later. Others occur spontaneously, without any external stimulus at all. These spontaneous otoacoustic emissions arise from the cochlea itself, appear to be generated by the sustained mechanical activity of the outer hair cells, and are present in a significant proportion of people with healthy hearing, though most people are completely unaware of them. At frequencies where they occur, they are measurable by external microphone, but are too quiet to be audible to the hearer. The relevance of otoacoustic emissions to the hum becomes clearer when the mechanism is considered carefully. If the cochlea can produce a tonal signal spontaneously and without external cause, there is no structural reason why a hearer would be able to distinguish that signal from one arriving externally. The experience of hearing something is the experience of a nerve signal reaching the brain. Whether that signal was generated by an external acoustic source, by the cochlea's own mechanical activity, or by some other internal pathway, is not information carried in the signal itself. The brain receives the signal and interprets it as sound. The experience of hearing is real, regardless of where the sound was generated. There is a complication. The frequencies at which spontaneous otoacoustic emissions have most commonly been documented in clinical settings are generally higher than the range most hum hearers describe. Documented examples tend to cluster in the range of several hundred to several thousand hertz, well above the 30 to 80 hertz range typical of hearer accounts. This does not rule out the mechanism. Lower frequency examples have been recorded in clinical literature, and the cochlear mechanics of low frequency hearing involve structural regions and cell populations somewhat different from those most associated with higher frequency emission activity. It is possible that in a subset of individuals, the active mechanical system of the cochlea can fall into a sustained low-frequency oscillation that generates a perception in the range where hum hearers consistently locate their experience. The clinical documentation for this remains thinner than the documentation for higher frequency examples, and research specifically targeting the low-frequency end of the otoacoustic emission range in hum hearer populations has not been conducted at the scale that would permit a definitive answer. What the otoacoustic emission hypothesis accounts for, well, is the pattern of non-universality. If the sound is generated within the cochlea of the hearer, the person beside them, with a cochlea that operates slightly differently, with a different distribution of hair cell activity, with different mechanical properties in the fluid and membrane systems of their inner ear, would have no more reason to hear it than they would have to share the hearer's tinnitus. The sound belongs to the hearer's ear and not to the acoustic environment around them, which is why a calibrated microphone placed in the same room detects nothing, and why two people can stand at the same kitchen window with the same window open to the same night air and have entirely different experiences of the silence. The otoacoustic emission hypothesis also provides a framework for thinking about why the hum appears to be consistent across many encounters in ways that are difficult to account for if the source is external and variable. The mechanical properties of a given cochlea are relatively stable over time. If the source of the sound is a sustained oscillation in the cochlear mechanics of that specific ear, the sound would be expected to have a relatively stable character, similar frequency, similar quality, similar baseline intensity across many hearing episodes. This is consistent with what many hearers report, not a variable, intermittent noise that changes character from day to day, but something that feels like the same sound arriving each time, predictable in its texture, even if unpredictable in its apparent timing. None of this means the hum is imagined. The word imagined, in this context, carries a connotation that does not accurately reflect the mechanism being described. An otoacoustic emission is a real mechanical event. The hair cells of the cochlea are physically moving. A signal is genuinely being generated. The experience of sound that results is a response to a real physical process, not a construction of anxiety or expectation. The distinction between a sound arriving from outside and a sound generated within the ear is a distinction in source, not a distinction in reality. Both are real. Both produce genuine auditory experience. The location of the source does not determine the authenticity of the hearing. Alongside the specific hypotheses, several researchers have explored the question from a different starting point, not asking what is generating the whom, but asking what is unusual about the people who perceive it. This is a different kind of research, and it carries different implications. If hearers and non-hearers differ in some measurable way, that difference might illuminate the mechanism regardless of whether the source is internal or external. An external source present for everyone but perceived only by some implies a difference in sensitivity or sensory processing. An internal source present in the hearer's own ear implies a difference in cochlear mechanics. In either case, the hearer is not perceiving something that non-hearers are choosing not to notice. The hearer is perceiving something that is, for them, genuinely and physically present. The specific ways in which hearers might differ from non-hearers have been explored in limited but suggestive research. Some investigators have pointed to differences in how the auditory system processes continuous low-frequency stimulation, whether certain nervous systems are better adapted to extract signal from sustained low-frequency mechanical input, or whether certain cochlear configurations amplify or resonate at low-frequency ranges more readily. Others have suggested that differences in central auditory processing, the way the brain organizes and interprets incoming auditory information, might determine whether a very faint or marginally above threshold low-frequency signal is perceived consciously or filtered out below the level of awareness. The architecture of what the brain chooses to notice, given the same incoming signal, differs between individuals in ways that audiological research has documented across many different contexts, not just the whom. There is also a body of evidence suggesting that sensitivity to very low frequency and infrasonic signals, sound below the conventional lower limit of human hearing at approximately 20 Hz, is not uniform across individuals. Documented individual variation in infrasound sensitivity is real and measurable in controlled laboratory settings. Some people respond to infrasonic stimulation with measurable physiological changes, including alterations in heart rate and respiration, even when they cannot identify the presence of a signal consciously. Others show no such response at the same stimulus levels. This documented range of individual sensitivity to very low frequency mechanical energy provides a plausible biological framework for why a signal in the environment that is imperceptible to most people might be clearly and consistently perceived by a small minority. Low frequency sound moves through the body differently from higher frequency sound. High frequencies are largely received through the outer ear and processed through the standard auditory pathway. Very low frequencies, particularly in the infrasonic range, can couple directly to the body's tissues and bones, setting up resonance effects in cavities and structures throughout the body, rather than being received primarily through the ear canal. This is why infrasound can sometimes be felt in the chest or perceived as pressure before it is identified as sound. The mechanical coupling bypasses some of the standard auditory anatomy and arrives at the nervous system through a different route. Hearer reports of a vibration felt slightly more in the chest than in the ears are consistent with this mechanism, and they recur across reports from different countries and different circumstances with enough regularity to suggest they are describing the same physical phenomenon, rather than independently inventing a similar metaphor. A research team examining low-frequency sensitivity in the laboratory has noted that the threshold for detecting very low-frequency tones through bone conduction, the direct transmission of mechanical vibration through the skull to the cochlea, is different from, and in some cases lower than, the threshold for detecting the same tone through the standard air conduction pathway through the ear canal. This means that for frequencies at the very low end of the audible range, the ear is conventionally understood, the outer ear, the canal, the eardrum, the acicular chain, may not be the primary receptor. The cochlea, reached by vibration traveling through the bones of the skull, may be responding to mechanical energy that arrived without passing through the standard route. This is not hypothetical in principle. Bone conduction is a well-established clinical and audiological fact used in hearing aids and in musical instruments pressed against the skull. Its specific role in low-frequency sensitivity at the extreme lower edge of the audible range is, however, less completely understood. This complexity in the auditory pathway itself makes the study of low-frequency perception more difficult. Standard audiometric tests are designed around the air conduction pathway. They test hearing at frequencies typically starting at 250 Hz and rising, which means that the auditory function of a human hearer at 40 or 50 Hz, the range where their experience is located, is usually not captured by a standard clinical hearing test at all. A hearer who reports that their audiogram was entirely normal is not providing evidence against the reality of their perception. They are confirming that their hearing in the tested frequency range is intact. The untested frequency range, below the floor of standard audiometry, is precisely where their experience lives. A small number of audiological researchers have begun adapting testing protocols to examine hearing at these very low frequencies, and the results have been instructive in limited ways. Some individuals who report Hume-like perceptions show measurable differences in low-frequency auditory sensitivity compared to control groups. The research is preliminary and the sample small, but the direction of the findings is consistent enough to support continued investigation rather than ruling the line of inquiry out. What these studies have not yet established is whether the difference in sensitivity is a cause of the hearer experience, whether being more sensitive to low-frequency signals makes a person more likely to encounter something at that frequency range and identify it, or whether it is a consequence, a learned perceptual heightening of attention to a frequency range that became salient once the hum experience began. Taken together, the scientific proposals move in two broad directions that are not mutually exclusive. Either something external is generating real low-frequency energy, and certain individuals are detecting it through sensory pathways that differ from the majority, or something within the ear itself is generating a signal that is experienced as sound originating outside the body, or, and this may be the most accurate framing, some combination of both is occurring in different cases, and what researchers and hearers call the hum is not a single phenomenon with a single explanation, but a convergent experience with more than one underlying pathway. The fact that these hypotheses do not yet converge on a single answer is not a failure of the research. The frequency range in question is one of the least studied in all of auditory science, in part because standard instruments and standard protocols were not designed with it in mind, and in part because the population of people whose experience sits in this range is small enough that clinical research has historically had difficulty assembling adequate sample sizes. The field is not static. Measurement technology for very low frequencies has improved considerably. The aggregation of hearer reports in searchable databases has made the phenomenon more visible and more tractable for researchers who might otherwise have encountered only isolated cases. Audiological interest in low-frequency sensitivity as a distinct research question has grown, slowly, in response to the accumulating evidence that individual differences in this range are real and potentially meaningful. A calibrated sensor placed in a quiet room, adjusted to its most sensitive setting, watching the frequency range below 100 Hz for any trace of signal. This is the physical situation at the edge of most hum investigations. The needle moves occasionally. The signal it registers may be from the building's own structure, settling and flexing with temperature change. It may be from traffic on a road several blocks away, the low-frequency component of the engine noise surviving long after the higher frequencies have scattered. It may be microseismic energy arriving from the seafloor of an ocean hundreds of miles distant. It may be none of these, background electronic noise in the instrument itself, the hum of its own power supply, the faint interaction of the sensor with the electromagnetic environment of the room. Reading that output requires careful calibration and careful interpretation. What the sensor measures is the acoustic environment of the room. What the hearer reports is an experience that may or may not correspond to anything that sensor is equipped to find. If the source is within the hearer's cochlea, no external microphone will find it, regardless of sensitivity. The measurement and the experience are looking for each other across a gap that the current understanding of the phenomenon has not yet fully bridged. Both the measurement and the experience are real. The gap between them is the open space where the science continues to work. In the deep structural mechanics of the cochlea, something is happening that science has only partly mapped. The outer hair cells, tens of thousands of them, arranged in 3 rows along the spiral length of the basilar membrane, are electromotile. They change shape in response to electrical signals. They do this rapidly enough to contribute to the mechanics of hearing at very high frequencies. In doing so, they are participating in an active feedback loop whose outputs are not fully contained within the cochlea's passive receiving function. The cochlea is not a microphone. It is a powered system with its own mechanical contribution to the signals it processes. In certain states, in certain individuals, under conditions not yet fully characterized, that powered system may sustain a vibration of its own. A clinical audiologist placing a microphone at the entrance to the ear canal and watching the readout with care is watching a device that is listening to the ear rather than through it. The signal it registers, when it registers one, came from inside. The hair cells produced it. The fluid and membrane transmitted it outward. What the person whose ear this is experiences, while the audiologist watches the readout, is the subject of the whom inquiry, as precisely as it can be stated in a single image. The ear is listening to itself. Whether that listening is part of the explanation for what hungers perceive, or only one strand of a multi-stranded answer, or a mechanism that applies in some cases and not others, that question persists, open and quiet, in the space the instruments have not yet closed. The cochlear emission plays on, in the sound-dampened room, faint enough that the person whose ear it comes from cannot hear it consciously. The audiologist notes the frequency, notes the amplitude, notes the remarkable fact that the tissue is producing this without being asked, without an external prompt, through the same active mechanical process that allows that ear to hear, at other moments, a whispered word across a room. The body's inner mechanisms are precise and elaborate past easy summary, and within that precision, in the region of the spiral where the basilar membrane is widest and responds to its lowest frequencies, something continues to move, steady, sourceless to any external observer, and in certain ears perceptible. A woman in her mid-50s sits at a kitchen table in the dark before dawn. The town outside is a coastal one, small enough that no traffic moves at this hour, quiet enough that the ambient sound of the place is simply the low breath of the sea somewhere beyond the houses. Her tea has been cooling for a while. She is not doing anything in particular. She is listening, the way a person listens when they are not sure whether what they are hearing is a sound or the memory of one, that particular stillness of attention that involves holding very still and waiting to see if the thing continues. It continues. It has continued every morning for 3 years, low and steady, arriving from no particular direction, felt slightly more in the chest than in the ears, present whether the windows are open or closed, whether the heating is running or off. She has had her hearing tested. She has had her blood pressure checked. She has stood in the garden in February in a coat at 4 in the morning to see if the sound was different outdoors, and it was not especially different, just the same low, sourceless drone, patient and unhurried, as though it had been there long before she arrived, and expected to remain long after she went back inside. She is not the only person sitting somewhere in the dark this morning, with that same quality of attention turned towards something no one else in the house can hear. The data on this, gathered across multiple countries and multiple decades, points consistently to someone very much like her, middle-aged more likely than not, living near a coast, in a place where the background noise of ordinary life is quiet enough that something very faint and very low has room to be noticed. The profile that emerges from the surveys and studies is not a dramatic one. It is the profile of a person at a kitchen table, in the early hours, holding still. What the data collected from hearer populations across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia consistently shows is that the majority of people who report the hum fall within the age range of roughly 40 to 70 years. The concentration is notable enough that researchers have considered it seriously as a potential clue. Age-related changes in the inner ear are well documented. The cochlea shifts its sensitivity over time. The central auditory processing systems adjust in ways that are not always straightforward, and it is possible that some of those adjustments could make certain low-frequency signals more perceptible to an older ear than to a younger one, or could alter the threshold at which internally generated sounds become noticeable against the background of an otherwise quiet nervous system. None of this is settled. It is the kind of careful, tentative reasoning that good science produces when the evidence points towards something without yet pointing clearly enough to confirm it. The woman at the table is not thinking about any of this. She is holding her cup and listening and watching the sky outside the window begin to shift from black toward the particular dark blue that precedes dawn on a clear morning near the sea. The sound is what it always is. She has stopped expecting it to change. Coastal and rural areas appear in the hearer data with a consistency that researchers have noted across multiple independent studies. The pattern is not absolute. The hum has been reported in towns and cities across a wide range of environments, but the concentration of reports in quieter settings has a plausible explanation that most investigators find reasonable. In an urban environment with sustained ambient noise, a very faint low-frequency signal might simply be masked, sitting below the level at which it could be consciously distinguished from the general texture of background sound. In a place where the noise floor is very low, a coastal village, a rural valley, a small inland town where the loudest thing at 3 in the morning is a single car passing on a distant road, a signal at 40 hertz would have considerably less to hide behind. The silence does not create the signal, it allows it to be found. A valley like that, at night, with no city glow visible in any direction, is a particular kind of quiet. The ambient noise floor in such places can fall low enough that a person with sensitive hearing becomes aware of sounds that a city dweller would never register: the settling of a house's timber frame, the low-frequency components of wind moving over a ridge a mile away, the specific subsonic character of the earth simply continuing its ordinary operations beneath the surface. In places like this, the hum is reported at a higher rate than the general population average. Whether that is because the hearers in those places are genuinely perceiving something that exists in the acoustic environment, or because the quietness of the place allows an internal signal to emerge above the perceptual threshold, remains an open question that the data alone cannot answer. What it can answer with reasonable confidence is the question of what hearers are not. Formal psychological evaluations conducted as part of both the federal investigation into one well-documented American case and several British studies into hearer populations arrived at a consistent finding that was perhaps more interesting for what it ruled out than for what it confirmed. The hearer populations assessed in those studies did not show the clinical profile associated with mass psychogenic illness. The pattern of reports did not spread socially. Hearers did not appear in clusters that corresponded to who knew whom or which neighborhoods had been in contact with which. Many hearers were geographically isolated from one another and had not heard of the phenomenon before they began experiencing it themselves. There was no rapid symptom escalation of the kind that characterizes documented cases of mass psychogenic events. The clinicians who conducted these assessments described the hearer populations in their notes and published findings using variations of the same word: stable, not credulous, not suggestible, not distressed in any way that preceded or explained the perception. Simply people who were hearing something. That word stable appears in the margins of clinical notes and the conclusions of formal reports with a frequency that suggests the assessors themselves found it worth registering. A researcher in Bristol, reviewing interview transcripts from hearer sessions, wrote it beside one subject's name, and then beside the next, and then the next, the same word moving down a column of careful clinical assessments like a quiet attestation. These are ordinary people. This is not an explanation. One of the most consistently reported features of hearer accounts across countries and across decades is the description of a specific, identifiable onset. Not a gradual emergence, not a slow increase in awareness over time, but a moment, a morning, a particular hour, sometimes a specific minute, when the sound was simply there, where before it had not been. A Tuesday in October just after 7, the light coming through the curtains at a particular angle. A Sunday afternoon in February, sitting in the front room with the television off, the house so quiet that the arrival of something new in that quiet was immediately and unmistakably apparent. A summer evening in a garden, the first moths beginning to move around the porch light, the low drone settling in like a neighbor's engine that never turned off. The precision of these onset memories, reported years and sometimes decades after the fact, is itself something researchers have noted. Tinnitus, the closest clinically defined condition to what whom hearers describe, typically develops gradually, the perception building slowly over time as hearing changes. The sudden onset pattern described by the majority of whom hearers is distinct from this, distinct enough that clinicians who have studied both populations have flagged it as a potentially important diagnostic feature, something that might eventually help to separate whatever the whom is from what it superficially resembles. The woman at the kitchen table remembers exactly when it arrived. The detail of that morning has not faded. It sits in her memory with the peculiar clarity of small events that turned out to matter. In Vancouver, a man describes the same kind of onset, the specific morning the sound arrived, the precise domestic context he was in. The fact that he first assumed a piece of equipment in the house was running and spent several minutes checking appliances before accepting that there were no appliances to check. He is a researcher by training. He knows the difference between a perception that can be explained and one that resists explanation. When his own perception began to resist explanation, he began methodically to study it, eventually contributing significantly to the body of work that attempts to make systematic sense of what hearer populations around the world are experiencing. The project that aggregates hearer reports into a searchable geographic database began, in part, out of the recognition that the data being generated by individual hearers had nowhere systematic to go. Hearers were filing reports with local authorities who had no framework for them, writing letters to newspapers, posting in online communities where accounts accumulated without any structure that could be analyzed. The World Huma Map And Database Project changed that not by solving the question of what the hume is, but by creating a common form, a standardized record that any hearer anywhere in the world could complete, submitting their location, the date of onset, an estimate of the frequency they perceived, and a description of the symptoms they experienced alongside it. What accumulated over time was not an explanation, it was a map. The map, as it appears on a screen, shows hundreds of small location markers distributed across the continents. North America carries a significant concentration, particularly across the western United States and the coastal areas of Canada. The United Kingdom is well represented, especially the western and northern regions. Australia shows markers along its eastern and southern coasts. Scattered points appear across continental Europe, in Scandinavia, across parts of South America and Southeast Asia. Each marker is a person who filled out a form. Each form has a date, a frequency estimate, a location, and a description that typically includes some variation of the same phrase. Low, steady, sourceless, present at night, absent to everyone else. The database is not a perfect scientific instrument. Self-reported data has known limitations, and the population of people who are motivated to submit a report to an online database is not a random sample of the hearer community. But it is, by a considerable margin, the most comprehensive picture of global hume report distribution currently available to anyone who wants to study the phenomenon seriously. And the pattern it reveals is not a random scatter. There are clusters. There are regions of higher concentration. There are blank areas where, for reasons that are not clear, the reports thin out or disappear entirely. The pattern is real even if what generates it is not yet understood. In the town where the woman at the kitchen table lives, there are two other people, as far as she knows, who hear what she hears. She met one of them at a community meeting several years ago, when the subject came up briefly and then was mostly set aside. They spoke afterward, standing in a car park in the dark, comparing notes with the quiet efficiency of people who have had to describe the same thing many times to many people who could not hear it. The frequency, the quality, the way it was worse indoors, the way it was worst at night, in the particular stillness of the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, when the rest of the world had set everything down. They agreed on all of it. The third person who hears it in that town she has never met. She knows of them only from a pin on a map. Sleep disturbance is among the most commonly reported symptoms across hearer accounts, and it follows a logic that requires very little specialist knowledge to understand. A sound that is present continuously, that is louder in quiet environments, that has no external source, a person can address or remove, and that is most noticeable in the particular silence of a bedroom at 2 in the morning. Such a sound will, over time, and for some proportion of the people who perceive it, interfere with sleep in the way that any low-grade persistent intrusion interferes with sleep, not dramatically, not in a way that constitutes an emergency, simply as a feature of the experience that adds a certain quality of wakefulness to the hours that are supposed to be restful. The woman at the table has accommodated this over time in the way people accommodate things that do not go away. She goes to bed later than she once did, when she has found that earlier hours are harder. She keeps a book nearby. She has learned by a process of slow and quiet experimentation that she did not plan and cannot fully describe. The specific angle of attention that allows the sound to exist at the edge of awareness, rather than at its center, a kind of soft focus applied to hearing rather than to sight, the perceptual equivalent of not quite looking at the thing, which turns out to make it easier to hold. This quality of accommodation, quiet, practical, undramatic, appears across hearing accounts from different countries and different backgrounds with the same regularity as the description of the sound itself. People find a way to exist alongside a perception they cannot resolve. They try things that do not work, and then they try other things, and eventually they arrive at some arrangement with the sound that is not comfortable, exactly, but is sustainable. The resignation in this is not defeat. It is closer to the particular patience of a person who has waited a long time for an answer and has decided, without bitterness, that they may simply have to wait longer. The headaches that accompany the human for a significant proportion of hearers, persistent, mild to moderate, concentrated often at the temples or behind the eyes, and the pressure sensations in the ears that many describe as distinct from ordinary ear discomfort, have not been definitively linked to any known mechanism in the research literature. They may be a consequence of the perception itself, the physiological result of sustained exposure to low-frequency energy at the relevant frequencies. They may be the consequence of chronic mild sleep disruption. They may reflect something about the underlying mechanism generating the perception. The research does not, as yet, resolve this. The symptoms are consistently reported. Their cause is consistently unconfirmed. What is confirmed across multiple independent lines of inquiry is that these are not imagined symptoms, not the product of a community talking itself into shared discomfort, not the expression of anxiety seeking a somatic form. The people who report them are, as the clinical assessors found, stable, observant, often highly specific in their descriptions, in the way that people who have spent years attending carefully to a single persistent phenomena become specific. A hearer who has been listening to the same sound for a decade has had a great deal of time to characterize it, and the characterizations that emerge from those long, careful accounts of something heard in the quiet of ordinary domestic life tend to be among the most precise and internally consistent data in the entire literature. In the demographic picture that the research paints, the hearer is more often a woman than a man, though men are well represented in the hearer population, and the gender distribution is not dramatic. The hearer is more often older than younger, and the hearer is more often rural or semi-rural than urban. These tendencies do not define any individual. The hearer community contains people of every age and background and situation, and the pattern has meaningful exceptions in every direction. But the tendencies are consistent enough across enough separate studies that researchers take them seriously, not as explanations but as coordinates, data points that, combined with everything else in the picture, might eventually help to locate whatever is at the center of the phenomena. The age pattern in particular carries an implication that researchers are careful about but do not ignore. If hearing the hum is associated with middle age and beyond, and if that association holds across cultures and geographies, then something about the aging auditory system, either its changing peripheral sensitivity or the adjustments that occur over time in how the brain processes low-frequency sound, or some combination of these, may be a prerequisite for the experience. Not a malfunction, not a pathology. Simply a configuration of the auditory system that some people reach at some point in their lives, and that once reached makes perceptible something that was previously either absent or below threshold. A hearing system that has lived in the world for 5 decades is a different instrument from the one it was at 20. The outer hair cells of the cochlea change. The neural pathways that carry low-frequency information into the central auditory system are processed differently. The brain's model of what constitutes background silence, built up over decades of acoustic experience, may shift in ways that open space for a signal that was always arriving but never before distinguished from the noise around it. This is speculative. It is the kind of speculation that researchers flag clearly and then set aside while they continue working. But it is not idle speculation. It has the shape of a real hypothesis, grounded in real auditory neuroscience, waiting for the specific evidence that would allow it to be tested properly. The testing in this field is complicated. A sound that is not reliably detectable by external instruments, heard by roughly 2 to 4% of any given population, with no confirmed single source, presenting differently in different geographic locations. This is not a phenomenon that lends itself to the standard experimental approaches of acoustic science. You cannot bring it into a laboratory. You cannot reliably reproduce it. You can measure low-frequency energy in the environments where hearers report it, and sometimes find something there, and sometimes find nothing, and have no certain way of knowing whether the absence of a measurement means the absence of the signal or the limitation of the instruments deployed to find it. What researchers can do, and what the most serious work in this field does, is aggregate, gather reports, standardize the descriptions, map the distribution, look for the patterns in the data that individual reports cannot reveal. Search for correlations between hearer locations and known sources of low-frequency energy. Pipelines, coastlines, geological features, industrial installations. Compare the onset profiles and symptom descriptions across populations that had no contact with one another. Build a picture from the parts that are available, knowing that the picture is incomplete and that what is missing may be the most important thing in it. The woman at the table is part of that picture, though she may not think of herself that way. The form she filled out, her location, the date of October when the sound arrived, her estimate of its frequency somewhere in the low registers, the description of the headaches that accompanied it in the early months before she adjusted, is a single point on the map, one pin. One Tuesday morning held in a database alongside hundreds of others, each one a specific person in a specific room on a specific morning when something began. A man on the coast of Western Australia who first noticed it while sitting in his car in a car park and assumed the engine was still running. A woman in rural Scotland who spent an entire winter convinced a piece of agricultural equipment somewhere on the local farms was malfunctioning before she realized the equipment would not run at 3 in the morning. A retired teacher in New England who began hearing it during a period of unusual quiet in the house and initially thought it was the refrigerator in the kitchen below, a theory she tested systematically before abandoning. Each of them is a pin. Each pin is a morning. The consistency of what they describe across such different lives and places is one of the more striking features of the data, taken as a whole. The frequency range, the nighttime intensification, the indoor quality, the way the sound occupies no particular direction, not coming from the left or the right, or the window or the wall, simply present the way temperature is present in a room, the way it cannot be stopped by blocking the ears, the detail that a significant proportion of hearers report discovering independently, and that points, in a way researchers note with interest, towards something other than a simple external acoustic source propagating through the air the way ordinary sound does. A sound that does not diminish when the ears are blocked is a sound that may not be reaching the auditory system through the standard air conduction pathway. It may be arriving through bone conduction, the direct transmission of vibration through the skull and jaw into the inner ear structures, which bypasses the outer ear canal entirely. It may be generated within the ear itself, a signal created rather than received. It may be something the auditory cortex is producing, a central phenomenon rather than a peripheral one, the brain generating a sound-like percept without a corresponding input from outside the body. Or it may be that hearers find the sound not diminished when they block their ears, because what they are blocking is not what is producing the perception, and the something else that is producing it continues uninterrupted. This is where the science sits with a quality of genuine openness that is not frustration, but is something more patient than that. The lines of inquiry are real, the hypotheses are grounded, the data is accumulating, and the sound, for the people who hear it, continues on its own schedule without consulting any of this. On a quiet night in a small coastal town, with the dawn still an hour away, the sound is at its most present. The house around the woman at the table is fully still. Her tea has gone cold. The window shows a sky that is beginning to lose its darkest blue and move towards something that is not yet light, but is no longer quite the same as darkness. That particular shift in the quality of the air before dawn that seems to happen in the sky before it happens on the ground. She is not distressed. This is worth being clear about. Whatever the sound is, wherever it comes from, whatever generates the perception, whatever, in the particular configuration of her inner ear, or her auditory cortex, or the acoustic environment of this coastal town, has made it available to her in a way it is apparently not available to her neighbors. It has not broken anything. It has asked a question she cannot answer and then stayed to repeat the question indefinitely. She has learned to find that, on most mornings, simply interesting rather than anything else. The people who have studied the Hume, the researchers who have deployed instruments in fields and desert landscapes and English towns, who have sat with hearers and listened to detailed descriptions of the sound's quality and frequency and the specific way it modulates at certain times of day, have not arrived at a conclusion. The literature ends repeatedly in the same place. The sound is real to those who experience it. The source remains unidentified in the majority of cases, and the question of what generates the perception in this particular subset of the population, and not in the much larger population around them, has not yet received an answer that satisfies the evidence from every direction. The question is open. It has been open for decades. It will likely remain open for some time, because the phenomenon does not behave in ways that make it easy to close. It is too quiet. It is too individual. It is too inconsistently detectable by the instruments that have been pointed at it. And it is, in the lived experience of the people who carry it through their days and their nights, too consistent, too specific, too precisely described across too many independent accounts to be anything other than a genuine perception of something real. What that something is, whether it sits in the earth, in the ocean, in the layers of industrial infrastructure threading through the ground beneath the surface of the inhabited world, in the frequencies of signals traveling thousands of miles through rock and water, or whether it arises from within the extraordinary complexity of the human auditory system itself, which is capable, as clinical evidence confirms, of generating its own sounds in perfect silence, remains one of the more genuinely open questions in a field that is not short of open questions. The map holds it for now. Hundreds of points scattered across the sleeping world, each one a person and a morning and a sound that arrived without announcing itself and has not left. Some of them are awake right now,